Adam had always been a bit of an outsider. He had grown up in a small town in the middle of nowhere, and his family had always been known for their strange ways. They kept to themselves and rarely interacted with the rest of the community. But it wasn't until Adam had reached adulthood that the townspeople began to realize just how strange he really was. It started with a few rumors that circulated around town. People were saying that Adam had some sort of strange power that allowed him to melt anything he touched. At first, nobody believed it. It seemed too absurd to be true. But then, people started disappearing. They would go to Adam's house for one reason or another, and they would never come back. The townspeople were terrified, and they began to avoid Adam at all costs. But one day, a group of teenagers decided to investigate. They had always been curious about Adam and his strange powers, and they wanted to find out once and for all if the rumors were true. They snuck up to Adam's house late one night, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they approached the front door, they heard a strange noise coming from inside. It sounded like someone was screaming. They burst through the door and were met with a horrific sight. Adam was standing in the middle of the room, his body contorted and twisted in agony. In front of him, a young woman lay on the floor, her body melting into a puddle of flesh and bone. The teenagers screamed and ran out of the house, but they knew that they had to do something about Adam. They couldn't let him continue to hurt people like this. They went to the local authorities, but they were met with skepticism. The police had never heard of anything like this before, and they didn't believe that Adam was capable of such a thing. The townspeople decided to take matters into their own hands. They formed a mob and marched up to Adam's house, intent on taking him down. Adam tried to defend himself, but he was quickly overpowered. The mob beat him senseless and dragged him out of his house. They tied him to a stake and set him on fire. As the flames consumed his body, Adam let out a blood-curdling scream. The townspeople watched in horror as he melted before their eyes, his flesh dripping from his bones and pooling on the ground below. But even in death, Adam's legacy lived on. The townspeople knew that they could never forget what he had done, and they made sure to warn future generations about the dangers of messing with the unknown. And although the town eventually moved on and forgot about Adam, his memory lived on in the hearts of those who had witnessed his gruesome power firsthand. The townspeople had thought that they had finally rid themselves of the terror that was Adam, but they were wrong. After the mob had set him on fire and he had melted away, strange occurrences began to happen around town. At first, it was just small things. Objects would melt or warp. When someone picked them up, and people started to feel uneasy whenever they entered the vicinity of Adam's old house. But as time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more intense. It started with animals. Pets in the town began to melt away or disappear, leaving behind only a gooey residue on the ground. Then, people started to disappear as well. They would go missing for days, only to turn up in a puddle of melted flesh and bone. The townspeople knew that they had to do something, but they were at a loss. They had already killed Adam, so who or what was responsible for these atrocities? It wasn't until a young boy went missing that they finally found their answer. The boy's mother had seen him playing outside earlier in the day, but when she went to check on him later, he was nowhere to be found. The townspeople searched high and low for the boy, but he was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until a few days later that they discovered his melted remains in an alleyway. But this time, they had a lead. One of the townspeople had seen a strange figure lurking around the boy's house on the day he had gone missing. They described it as a tall, shadowy figure that seemed to melt into the darkness. The townspeople immediately knew who they were dealing with. Adam had somehow managed to come back from the dead, and he was more powerful than ever. The townspeople banded together once again, determined to put an end to Adam's reign of terror once and for all. But this time, they knew they had to be more careful. They couldn't risk getting too close to him and falling victim to his power. They decided to lure Adam out of hiding by setting a trap. They built a giant furnace and filled it with all sorts of flammable materials. Then, they waited. It wasn't long before Adam appeared. He seemed to glide across the ground, his body almost fluid-like. The townspeople watched in horror as he made his way towards them, leaving a trail of melted ground. But as he got closer to the furnace, something strange happened. His body began to tremble and shake, as if he was losing control of his powers. The townspeople took advantage of his weakness and pushed him towards the furnace. Adam fought back with all his might, but he was no match for the strength of the townspeople. With one final push, they managed to push him into the furnace. The flames consumed him, and the townspeople watched in awe as his body melted away into nothing. They knew that they had finally put an end to the terror that had plagued their town for so long. But they also knew that they could never forget what had happened. They made sure to tell the story of Adam to future generations, so that they would always remember the dangers of meddling with things beyond their understanding.